5 Reasons War Happens. Christopher Blatt. Christopher Blatt is a professor at the University of Chicago Harris School of Public Policy. This article is drawn from his new book, Why We Fight, The Origins of War and the Path to Peace, published by Viking, an imprint of Penguin Publishing Group, a division of Penguin Random House, LLC. The views expressed are those of the author and do not reflect the official position of the university. United States Military Academy, Department of the Army or Department of Defense. 5 Reasons Why War Happens. Whether it's Russian President Vladimir Putin's threat of nuclear attack or China's belligerence in the Taiwan Strait, the United States appears to be moving closer to a war between great powers than at any time in recent decades. But while the risks are real and the United States must prepare for each of these conflicts, by focusing on when nations fight, and ignoring when they resolve conflicts peacefully and prevent escalation, then analysts and policymakers risk misjudging our adversaries and pursuing the wrong path. Paths to peace. People often blame the war in Ukraine largely on Putin's obsession and delusion. These certainly played a role, but stopping here would be stopping too soon. We must also pay attention to conflicts that did not occur. For years, Russia has threatened other neighbors with varying degrees of persuasion and force, from conquering Belarus to peacekeeping missions in Kazakhstan. Few of these power struggles have been successful. To find the true origins of conflict, analysts need to pay attention to these peaceful struggles. Enemies love to hate each other in peace. Struggle is simply bargaining through violence. This is what Chinese Communist leader Mao Zedong meant in 1938 when he said, "Politics is war without bloodshed, while war is politics with bloodshed." Mao was echoing the words of Prussian General Karl von Clausewitz, who a century ago reminded us that war is a continuation of politics by other means. 5 Reasons for War. Consider Russia's invasion of Ukraine. What do these 5 things tell us about why peace breaks down? 1. Uncountable. As a personalized dictator, Putin does not need to consider the interests of his soldiers and citizens. He can pursue any path that helps him maintain control of his regime. When leaders are unchecked and unaccountable to their people, they can ignore the costs of struggle that ordinary people bear. Instead, rulers can pursue their own agenda. That's why dictators are more likely to cause war. 2. Thought. Let's consider Putin again. Most stories about the current war focus on his nationalist obsessions and his desire for a glorious legacy. No matter what costs and risks he must bear, Putin is willing to pay the price in pursuit of glory and ideology. This is just one example of the invisible and ideological motivations for war that so many leaders possess: God's glory, freedom, or some nationalist vision. Society also has ideological motivations. Unlike the people of Belarus or Kazakhstan, the Ukrainians refuse to accept severe limitations on their sovereignty even though it, at first, appeared to represent relative military weakness. Like liberation movements throughout history, including American revolutionaries, they were willing to accept destruction and risk fighting partly in pursuit of their ideals. 3. Bias. Most accounts of the Russian invasion emphasize Putin's isolation and distance from the truth. He and his advisors underestimated the difficulty of war. This is a story of institutional bias, a system unwilling to inform leaders of bad news. Dictators are especially susceptible to this problem, but intelligence failures also plague democracies. Leaders can also be psychologically biased. Humans have an amazing ability to cling to false beliefs. We can be overconfident, underestimating the devastation of war and overestimating our chances of victory. And we underestimate and misjudge our opponents. These misperceptions can lead us to war. 4. Not sure. Focusing too much on biases and misperceptions obscures the more subtle role of uncertainty. In the dark times of war, policymakers do not know the enemy's strength or resolve. Buzzing. How unified will the West be? How likely are Ukrainians to resist? How capable is the Russian army? All of this is fundamentally uncertain, and many experts are genuinely surprised that Russia fared so poorly against all three, most of all, perhaps Putin himself. But uncertainty doesn't just mean that the costs of war are uncertain and that invasion is a gamble. There are real strategic obstacles to getting good information. You cannot count on your enemy's demonstration of resolve, because they have reason to bluff, hoping to reach a better deal without having to fight. Any poker player knows that, amid uncertainty, the optimal strategy is to never fold all the time. It's not always possible to call. The best strategy is to approach it probabilistically, occasionally gamble and invade. 5. Unreliable. When a declining power faces a rising power, how can we trust the rising power to commit to peace? It is better to pay the cruel price of war now to grasp our current advantage. Some scholars argue that such shifts in power and the commitment problems they create are at the root of every long war in history, from World War I to the US invasion of Iraq. Of course, this is not why Russia invaded Ukraine. However, it can help understand the timing. In 2022, Russia is said to have achieved the highest leverage over Ukraine. Ukraine is buying drones and defense missiles. And the country is increasingly more democratic and closer to Europe, with Putin, a dangerous example of freedom nearby. How can Ukraine commit to stopping either of these moves? We don't know what Putin and his commanders debated behind closed doors, but these trends could make the now or never argument for invasion. Putting the 5 wars together, like World War I and so many others, biased, misguided leaders with nationalist ambitions ignored the costs of war and pushed their society to violent destruction. But the explanation doesn't end there. There are also strategic origins. In the Russian case, as elsewhere, the problems of unchecked power, uncertainty, and commitment arising from the transfer of power have narrowed the scope of possible compromise to the point that Putin's psychological and institutional failures, his misconceptions and ideology, may lead him to pursue politics through violence. Mean. Paths to peace. If war happens when societies or their leaders downplay its costs, peace is preserved when our institutions make those costs hard to ignore. Successful, peaceful societies have built themselves a layer of insulation from all 5 types of failure. They check the power of autocrats. They have built institutions to reduce uncertainty, promote dialogue, and minimize misunderstandings. They had written constitutions and laws that made changes in power less dangerous. They have developed interventions, from sanctions to peacekeepers to mediators, that reduce our strategic and human incentives to fight rather than compromise. However, it is difficult to expect peace in a world where power in so many countries remains unchecked. Highly concentrated power is one of the most dangerous things in the world, because it highlights all 5 reasons for war. With unchecked leaders, nations are prone to their own idiosyncratic ideologies and biases. In their pursuit of power, autocrats also tend to shield themselves from important information. Placing too much influence in the hands of one person adds to the uncertainty and unpredictability of the situation. Almost by definition, unchecked rulers have difficulty making credible commitments. That is why the real root cause of the current war is undoubtedly Putin's concentration of power over the past 20 years. And that's why the world's most worrying trend may be in China, where a once controlled and institutionalized leader is gathering more and more power in his people. Admittedly, there is little any country can do to change the concentration of power in its opponent's political systems. But a solution cannot be found without an accurate diagnosis of the problem. Christopher Blatt is a professor at the University of Chicago Harris School of Public Policy. This article is drawn from his new book, Why We Fight: The Origins of War and the Path to Peace, published by Viking, an imprint of Penguin Publishing Group, a division of Penguin Random House, LLC. The views expressed are those of author and does not reflect the official views of the United States Military Academy, the Department of the Army, or the Department of Defense.